Cool. Thanks, Matt, and thanks, everybody. So I want to tell a long story pretty quickly tonight. So we're Alluvium. As we say here, we're human-centered AI for the industrial space. And these are some important phrases to us as a company. This is what we do. We put machine intelligence inside complex industrial workflows. And that's important for this audience, but that is effectively meaningless for the audience that we sell our products to. And the story that I want to tell today is how we as a business and as a team of people who are data scientists, engineers, product people, all of which come from software, none of which come from the industrial space, came to really understand and build products that really attacked the problems of our customers where they wanted us to start helping them. So we have two kind of catchphrases that we talk about around the product. We say our products help our customers understand stability, and through that they can perfect their production. And through the story that I want to tell tonight, I want to talk about why these ideas became important to us and how we ultimately kind of made them manifest through the technology. So this is the map that we often kind of keep in our heads as a group and as a team when we think about where different parts of an industrial organization actually interact with and have to use data in order to make decisions. The really important thing for us as a business is that we are there to kind of support decision making inside of these workflows, and that the sort of artificial intelligence or however you like to describe software that is there to enhance, supplement, and ultimately help guide experts in some ways can be viewed not only as a threat, but really as an existential threat to the kinds of customers that we want to work with. So as we think about kind of data being generated, let's say as a canonical example, inside an oil refinery, and I'll come back to oil refinery later, we kind of think of this map as the same bits generating, say, from that catalytic cracker, moving through the organization in different ways, and the people who are at these different levels of the organization having a very different relationship with those same data. Right, so the folks who wear hard hats, who sit out on the refinery platform, who deal with massive amounts of streaming data coming from an oil refinery, they are fundamentally constrained by their own kind of cognitive computational ability as humans and time. So if there are 5,000 to 10,000 sensors on a massive oil refinery and a team of maybe 50 people operating that refinery at any given time, the math on that is definitely against the operators being able to do anything analytic. So we often think of those folks as principally only being able to react to data. Temperature's too high, pressure's too low, we need to do something right now to change that, or simply recording it. Regularly scheduled inspections, moving around the refinery to make sure that things are operating normally. As that same data kind of moves out to the control room, and these are sort of abstract notions, sometimes the control room can literally be just the next door over in a refinery, but these people have a different relationship with data, right? So they are not necessarily constrained by time, but they are constrained by time in a kind of general sense. So they're not thinking minute to minute or hour to hour, they may be thinking daily, weekly, monthly. How do we kind of observe overall trends inside this refinery to make sure that it's operating as efficiently and effectively as possible? And what, if any, third-party data can we bring in? Right? We had a very dramatic example of this in the last weeks with Hurricane Harvey, right? So think about those operators who had to manage refineries and chemical plants inside the Houston area, knowing, given the meteorological data, what was coming and how they're going to react to that. And then as the data kind of ultimately meets its final resting place in the from the cloud, but you can think of this as like a corporate level. So you have, in this case, maybe folks sitting in Houston who are not sitting out in the field, who are not at all constrained by time. They can look long periods in history. They can do forensic analyses. They're not trying to understand how the plant is operating today. They're trying to understand how it has operated, say, over the last quarter, the last year. Who are my best vendors? How do I squeeze another 1 or 1.5% of production out of my system? So as we kind of, as a company and as software designers and data scientists think about how we can kind of enter into this space, where we started as a business was thinking about the edge. And fundamentally, as a founder, the advantage that I saw in building machine learning technology for the industrial space was, how do I solve for that cognitive constraint that the men and women who wear hard hats out on the refinery floor have to deal with every day? But if we think about just like under the hood of your favorite machine learning algorithm. It's mostly just matrix operations and algebra. So what that's really good at is taking a high dimensional problem, turning it into a lower dimensional problem. And what these folks deal with every day are very, very high dimensional problems, right? If you've ever had the opportunity, and we've been very fortunate in having the opportunity to go out and visit big complex factories, if I think about visiting my first refinery, I was stunned by two things. One, how hot it is. It's like 180 degrees without the fire retardant clothing on and the hard hat and everything else. But just how much data is kind of flowing by the eyeballs of someone who's expected to try to manage that, one person or two people over a 9 to 12-hour shift. So we built, really, in the beginning as a business, we built technology to deal with learning from streaming data off of platforms and systems that exist in the edge to try to build something that could reduce that information down into a metric or some universal way of understanding how well that system was working. And we kind of landed on this idea of stability, right? So stability is not the most exciting term, right? There's a lot, there's startups here, we're in a WeWork, so like we want to really be blowing the doors off with the most exciting term that we can come up with. Stability is not that. But if you go talk to someone whose job it is to own and operate a massive, capitally intensive industrial operation, stability is like the best possible thing that you could try to sell them. Unfortunately, what we found is that while the technology that we had built, and certainly the aspiration of large industrial customers to be able to leverage that was very high, we were faced with very steep institutional cultural barriers to entry. When you're working and you're trying to both bring new technology, but more than that, a kind of new way of thinking about how to manage and operate an old and very successful set of businesses through software, no matter how fancy your demo is, no matter how effective your pitch is, at the end of the day, you have people who either don't understand how this essentially fancy set of math and black box that they don't fully understand is going to affect their business, or view it as a threat or even existential threat to their own operation. And so what we found is that, I'll come back to that in a second. What we found is that many of our potential customers, they weren't customers yet, but many of the folks that we would talk to, say, a year ago, who we wanted to try to sell on, early stage startup stuff. We're saying, okay, let's do a proof of concept. Let's try to prove out the value of doing streaming, online learning to try to build out the stability analysis for your operation inside a small configuration of the plant. And we'd get some momentum. The teams would be really excited. And suddenly we'd run into a barrier that effectively, they more or less sounded like this. Drew, we think it's great. We're really excited about what you're building. We're not going to deploy it. And the reason for that is people are risk averse. But what we would come back to is a lot of, almost to an organization, they come back and say, listen, we want to try it, but what if we tried it on historical data that we have out in the cloud? What if we gave you some data from our production system and you kind of ran it through your magic black box and showed us what it could have informed us about after the fact, and maybe help at least us understand what the tangible value is here. And so we ended up hearing this over and over again, and sort of at the end of the year last year, I kind of stood up, or not literally in a dramatic way, but kind of realized that we didn't want to be building these kind of one-off proof of concepts for this kind of modality of interaction all the time, that there was actually a product there. That this idea that what we were presenting to customers was viewed as exciting, but also a little scary, meant that we had the wrong entry point. We were trying to get out as close to where that data was being generated because essentially that's what we wanted to do and that's what we thought was interesting, but our customers wanted to bring us all the way back to what was safest for them. Right? What's the lowest risk place that a company that's never done anything with artificial intelligence, machine learning, these buzzwords that they've heard constantly for the last year, 2 years, where could they actually sort of safely put it and try to get value out of it? All right, so what ultimately we needed to do is think, how can we build a product that's going to be successful for our business, but also help us build trust with the people that we want to be able to sell and work with? So quickly in the last 5 minutes, I want to show you the sort of quintessential example of that for the customer. So the picture that I'm showing you here is a very serious safety incident at one of the largest refineries in North America. It's down in Texas, and one of the first kind of partners or customers that we had an opportunity to work with was a large multinational oil and gas company who was kind of this canonical example of a customer who didn't want to move forward until we got some historical data from them. And the incident that you're looking at here is useful and was a learning point for us in our organization, because what we realized is that not only do you need to meet the customer at a point of which they're going to be able to appreciate and safely experiment with this new tool you're giving them, it's also really useful if the data that they give you has extremely high context and salience within the organization. So every large industrial organization in the world has incidents that look like this. And the people sitting around the table will have deep context and, sort of scars from dealing with incidents that look like this. So this company gave us the data of about 20 days leading up to this fire. And what they wanted to do is say, okay, show us how this stability score works, how it can be used to help us better understand, and ultimately show us some stuff that we already know, right? They invested hundreds of millions of dollars, thousands of man-hours to investigate this incident, and I'll show you why in just a second. So if we flip over here, this is actually the report from that incident. So through wonderful open data that the state of Texas provides, there are always these emission reports from any incident that happens at a refinery, a regulated refinery. So the interesting thing here, there's a couple of things you can see. The flaring incident lasts a very long time. So for those unfamiliar, flaring essentially means a safe burning of gas in order to avoid an incident like this. But at the time that this report was created, they still didn't know what the cause was. And so what we're able to do with our product, and I'm going to run out of time, but this is what it looks like. So we built a product called Alluvium Primer. I will not describe all of it in detail, but what this green line here shows the user is that overall stability score. So this represents that distillation, right? That high dimensional problem of about 10,000 sensors over 20 days, so tens of millions of observations of data from this refinery distilled down into a single new metric that the user now has to be able to get comfortable with and build context for. That's a challenge, right? You're not only introducing a new method, but you're introducing this new metric that they don't know about and, quite frankly, don't really have any reason to care about. So what the tool does is try to guide the user to where in the system it thinks that instability is coming from. And this is kind of an easy one, right? Because we know there's a huge fire at the end of this time series. So thankfully the tool works, and we see this sort of massive drop in stability right here. It corresponds to this alert card. And so for the demo, I'll just load it up. When you jump into that alert card, you can see a bunch of interesting stuff. And so this is a hierarchical view now of all the pressure data from that refinery. And these stability scores are rank ordered by their contribution to that instability. And so if you kind of scroll through here, you'll see a bunch of these things that look almost identical, right? So these are all pressure sensors in this case. And the stability scores are almost identical, right? And then they fall off the cliff right here. As you're scrolling through, now you get to this sensor called P001. And the most interesting thing for us as a company when we actually briefed this out to the customer is as soon as this came up, they all flipped their laptops open and started digging through the after-action report on this incident. And so, effectively in the tool, you would have gotten to this in about 2 clicks. And so now, how do you ground the user in a new metric for the first time, not understanding what stability is, but having high context for what this incident actually is? You allow them to see the raw data. And actually doing that for us was a huge turn in our, am I going to get live demo killed here? I tried to avoid this. Oh, here we go, good. So now we can actually see that line, or you saw it for a second. So I'm trying to reload this. But if you saw it in a flash there was that sort of red curve that sort of undulated up and down, and there was a blue line that traveled almost directly beneath that. And what that shows you is the actual pressure data from that sensor as compared to what our tool would have expected to see given the learning that it did through the data. And if we can get this to load up here on our guest network with limited bandwidth, there we go. I'll quickly scroll back down to it. It actually shows the signature of the event. So I'm out of time, but this is a melting fluid catalytic cracker. And this signature of that melting actually shows the pressure building up and the metal decaying, going back down into a regular zone, going back up, and then the breach of the pipe happens right here. The sensor falls off because it's no longer functioning. And so really to just finish, what we're able to do in a tool here designed to support forensic analysis is very quickly get the user to a real finding and reinforce the value, in this case, of doing that kind of dimensionality reduction quickly, but then allowing the customer to come back and confirm something or discover something that they didn't know. I'm out of time. I have a lot more to say. I can show a whole nother example of something less catastrophic but more interesting for the business in terms of constant changes in things like refineries. But find me afterwards. I'll talk about it then. Thank you, guys.
Very cool. Thank you so much. Any customers or industry that seem to be more open to all of this, you know, oil versus manufacturing versus any disparity? Or
I would say top down, what we would call process manufacturing seems to be the most leaning in on this. And it sort of makes sense. So if you think of discrete or kind of monorail manufacturing, so like a line of robots putting a car together, versus something like oil refining, which is highly interdependent, somewhat more complex, at least from a data perspective, the challenge of this dimensionality reduction is really, really tangible for them versus, you know, in a monorail, say additive or discrete manufacturing, it's a little easier to connect the dots because things literally happen down a line.
Thank you. All right, so Andrew should be somewhere with this nifty yellow box, which actually is a microphone. If anyone has a question. One over here.
Just out of curiosity for this event, there was in the Texas Department of Environment or whatever, there was a report that the cause was unknown. Once you showed, did they know the cause before you showed them that thing melted or no?
We did not know the cause. So the customer replied back to us sort of in this briefing meeting.
Did it help them identify the cause?
Yeah, well, so this was an old incident for them. So the nice thing is that they had perfect knowledge of what had happened here, down to sort of, you know, millimeter measurements on the incident. But for them, being able to see immediately, like, oh, I can get to that, at least an 80% version of that answer in 3 clicks, and then be able to go back and learn that as an institution. Ultimately, that's the real value for us in this. It's like the machine learning, the fancy math, the metrics, only thing that matters to them is if there's a unit change in stability, what does that mean for my business? And so the initial interaction with the tool is really supposed to start to, I mean, we call it Alluvium Primer, right? It's really supposed to get them to understand where we're coming from.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's a familiar face.
Nice catch.
Hey, Drew.
Yeah.
Been a little while.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about the trade-off between transparency and sophisticated models when it comes to talking with clients?
Yeah. So we effectively sell a fancy black box in terms of Alluvium Primer. And the tool is designed to sort of hierarchically peel back some of that black box and open it up to be able to show things like this. We keep it very, very structured because we don't want to build a tool that's effectively a kind of BI, you know, data visualization tool. We stay very narrowly focused on stability, and that's kind of the main line through which we try to communicate this, like, that is the thing we're selling you, that's the metric. If we can get you to understand why that's valuable for your company, then the transparency piece kind of falls out of how we design it, and of course the application is always being updated and redesigned. This is what's in production now. It seems ugly to look at it. But yeah, it's always it's a constant trade-off, and we lose business because we're not competing with Tableau, and some companies want that. That's not what we do.
All right, one last question over there.
Sounds like you're doing multimodal fusion of sensors. Like, can you tell us about the architecture, any of the methods you're using?
Yes, so we are not doing that specifically. Under the hood, what happens at least in Primer right now, is we lean pretty heavily on a shallow neural network. We use a long short-term memory model. It's really good at learning in an unsupervised way on the first pass, and then building iteratively off of what's called our operator evaluation component, which I didn't talk about at all, but we generate labels from the user and it gets smarter with every pass. So we don't do that specifically, but the software under the hood is kind of designed to be pretty general, so you can actually build whatever algorithm you like.
By the way, sorry if I missed that from your presentation, but the whole thing about working on people's historical data, that's to build trust, but that's also to access the data, right? Which you need to train the neural nets.
So interestingly, it's almost entirely to build trust. The software is designed to learn in an unsupervised way.
Okay.
But walking into a refinery customer and telling them that, they don't like. It doesn't matter to them. Yeah. There's no context for that method. And so, yes, one of the nice things about building it this way, and I'll just quickly talk about the software. So all of this is built on a streaming platform, even though this particular tool is used in a batch environment, which, for folks who've built this stuff in the room, know that's a terrible decision, because you're actually handicapping yourself technically for memory and speed and all kinds of stuff. But we built it this way because ultimately we want to be able to transfer all the knowledge that a customer puts into Primer out to the field. So part of the attraction is I can say to a customer, well, we can get you started on Primer. There's basically zero risk. You give us data, we can start. Customers or users can start learning from it. But after you've gotten to your first 100,000, 10,000 hours of use, and you say to me, Drew, the only thing I don't like about Primer is I have to wait for the data to get back to the database, I say, great, we can literally, all of that knowledge that your users and your analysts have put in can now be available to the folks in the field who need to know stuff immediately, effectively having trained a smart agent to go live out in the refinery with them.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Terrific.